Baik, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Selamat datang kembali di Plenary Session 2. Welcome again to our Plenary Session 2, Decarbonizing the Mobility System. And this plenary session will address the strategy of the decarbonization of the mobility system that will contribute to achieving the net zero imperatives. The Indonesian National Planning Minister's keynote speech will set the tone of the discussion by international experts in mobility who will share their insight and experience in planning, implementation, and the potential benefit of the decarbonization effort for the low carbon development. Let me introduce our moderator for this session, Professor Satryo S. Brodjonegoro, President of the Indonesian Academy of Science. And of course, for the keynote, His Excellency Suharso Monoarfa, Minister of National Development Planning, Republic of Indonesia. And all the panelists will be introduced by a moderator. And ladies and gentlemen, I will give this time to our moderator, Professor Satryo S. Brodjonegoro. Would you please?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity for Ibu and of course we would like to start this session, decarbonizing the mobility. Before that, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Ahmad Satryo from Maskeei, Indonesian Society for Conservation and Efficiency Energy. And of course, in the agenda, actually, Professor Satryo Brodjonegoro will lead this session, but because any another activity, Professor Satryo Sumantri Brodjonegoro cannot attend and lead this session, so I will lead this session. Yes, we have agenda that the first any keynote speech from His Excellency Suharso Monoarfa, Minister of National Development Planning, Republic of Indonesia. And then we also have a panelist, the first Ms. Alison Pridmore from International Energy Agency, and secondly Mr. Ali Izadi, Head of Asia Pacific Research, BloombergNEF, and then the third Hun Soo Kim, SVP Hyundai Motor Group Korea, and the fourth Professor Puji Lestari, Faculty of Civil and Environmental Engineering of ITB, or Institute of Technology of Bandung, and the fifth Ms. Chandana, Sasidharan, Alliance for Energy Efficiency Economy, India. Okay, yes, actually this session will talk about decarbonizing the mobility system. As we know, after we have international conference on the climate in Paris, I think in 2015, and then any Paris agreement, and after that we will start to do something in relation to mitigate greenhouse gas, and especially on the transportation system. Any effort how we can to entry as soon as possible in relation to adopt the lower motor vehicle or another device that can be reduce the carbon dioxide as soon as possible and effectively. So in relation with this session, actually we would like to invite if any idea or initiative or something like that in relation how we can to accelerate our effort to reduce the low carbon mobility. Of course, and we trust that any initiative and also discussion in relation to achieve the decarbonizing the mobility system, because that's one step in relation how we can to achieve on low carbon development initiative, especially on the sector of transportation. Of course, I would like to start this. First, of course, we will invite His Excellency Suharso Monoarfa, Minister of National Development Planning, Republic of Indonesia. So, please, His Excellency.
Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we give our appreciation to the Indonesia Energy Conservation and Efficiency Society for its continued support to the energy efficiency and conservation development in Indonesia, and to everyone who still commits to support Indonesia's low carbon development initiative amid this challenging situation. Indonesia government has continuously stepped up its commitment to cope with climate change and sustainable development issues by ensuring that environmental sustainability is embodied in our national development planning. Last year, Indonesia launched its first Green National Medium-Term Development Plan for 2020 to 2024. The plan incorporates low carbon development and climate resilience as a national priority aligned with Indonesia's commitment to sustainable development goals. However, the first year of implementation of Indonesia's medium-term development plan has been challenging, to say the least. Throughout the year, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on our life and livelihood. Yet, the large-scale social restriction or PSBB policy have also had a transitory positive effect on the environment. A recent study published in Nature Communication found a global decrease in carbon dioxide emission more extensive than in any global crisis since 1900 year, including the Second World War and the year 2008-2009 global financial crisis. On the other hand, the rebounding economy after the 2008-2009 crisis resulted in increased global emission as the stimulus and investment efforts were executed with insufficient regards for a sustainable green, low carbon approach. The recovery after the current crisis will face similar and considerable challenges. Getting to a new normal in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic must be accompanied by new perspectives, as we have learned from the current situation. In the next 2 years, we will strive to establish a greener recovery by valuing the economic, social, and environmental balance for a better and resilient world, or building back better with low carbon development. It also means a new normal in which we can easily hold efficient virtual or hybrid meetings, reducing cost and emission from travel. Today's event is an example. There may therefore be a positive legacy of the pandemic, a COVID dividend to invest in building back better. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Energy efficiency and conservation have a considerable role. It can be the first fuel to provide for energizing any activities and reduce emissions, lower pollution, and enhance energy security. Energy efficiency and conservation are essential strategies for building back better after COVID-19 pandemic and renewable energies development for energy sector policy. However, we are aware that the penetration of energy efficiency and conservation in Indonesia is still limited. In year 2019, the primary energy intensity indicator recorded a slight increase compared to a year before, from 1.8 to 1.9 billion oil equivalent per thousand US dollar. This number is still far from another country's energy efficiency position, especially compared to developed countries that have already optimized their energy to generate GDP per US dollar. For instance, Japan and England or UK energy intensity are under 1 billion oil equivalent per thousand US dollar respectively. As the effort to boost energy efficiency and conservation commitment, indicator to measure its progress is stated in National Development Medium-Term Plan 2020 to 2024, namely the primary energy intensity and the decreasing level of final energy intensity. In year 2024, it targets that the primary energy intensity reach 133.8 BOE per billion rupees.
Recording in progress.
And the final energy efficiency decreased around 0.8 BOE per billion rupiahs every year. RPJMN is constructed under Low Carbon Development Indonesia initiative as the framework for the long-term initiative. Increasing energy efficiency is one of the strategies of low carbon policy to deliver much better social and economic outcomes. The LCDI in high scenario projects that increasing energy efficiency would yield a reduction in energy to population intensity, the ratio of total energy consumption per person, by 3.5% in 2030 and by 4.5% in 2045. Emission intensity, the ratio of total GHG emission to value-added GDP, would fall by more than 1/3 in 2030 and 60% in 2045 relative to year 2018. Some programs have already implemented by the government to achieve the energy efficiency and conservation targets, such as implementing energy management through the energy audit and online monitoring, fuel energy savings by developing household gas connection infrastructure and other programs, supporting equipment efficiency by establishing the standards, increasing awareness of energy and user through education and socialization, supporting the establishment of energy service company, and developing a financial scheme for energy efficiency project, etc. However, the notable thing of every program that will implement is that the effort to achieve energy efficiency and conservation target should involve the action from every energy end user or every sector, residential, service, industry, and transportation sector. In other words, energy efficiency and conservation are not only the energy sector's responsibility, but also every sector that utilizes the energy. In closing, I would like to express my appreciation to the Maskeei, EEI, honorable speakers, committees, and all other participants for your warm and continuing support for energy efficiency and conservation in Indonesia. I do hope today's forum will be a productive platform to enhance awareness and collaboration from every stakeholder towards a greener, more resilient future. Thank you. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Okay, thank you very much for His Excellency Suharso Monoarfa, Minister of National Development Planning, Republic of Indonesia. And we would like to continue our this plenary session, but let me to shifting to the Indonesian language to make easier in relation to this session. Baik, Ibu-Ibu, Bapak-Bapak sekalian, kita akan segera mulai dengan panel discussion di dalam plenary session kedua yang bertopik Decarbonizing the Mobility System. Seperti yang saya sampaikan sebelumnya, bahwa di dalam plenary session ini, setelah kita mendengarkan keynote speak dari Bapak Suharso Monoarfa, Menteri Perencanaan Pembangunan Nasional, di mana tadi setidaknya ada beberapa catatan, setidaknya ada 4 catatan terkait dengan Low Carbon Development Initiative sebagai framework dalam rangka pembangunan jangka panjang kita, ya, di mana energi efisiensi menempati posisi yang sangat strategis di dalam upaya untuk menghemat sumber daya, terutama sumber daya energi, dalam kerangka pembangunan nasional jangka panjang tadi. Ada beberapa hal yang akan dilakukan, sebagian juga sudah dilakukan, tadi disampaikan oleh Pak Menteri. Yang pertama terkait dengan energi efisiensi manajemen, kemudian disampaikan juga yang lebih spesifik terkait dengan fuel efisiensi, kemudian juga rencana pengembangan energi efisiensi standar, ya. Di samping mendorong adanya partisipasi dari para profesional, termasuk dalam konteks ini dari perusahaan-perusahaan yang punya kapasitas dalam mendorong adanya efisiensi energi. Nah, itu tadi kira-kira yang disampaikan oleh Bapak Menteri terkait hal-hal yang akan dilaksanakan di Indonesia kita dalam rangka mencapai energi efisiensi. Baik, selanjutnya kita akan mengundang panelis kita. Seperti yang saya katakan di awal tadi, ada 5 seharusnya, tetapi 1 berhalangan hadir. Yang pertama ada Miss Alison Pridmore dari International Energy Agency. Kemudian yang kedua Mr. Ali Izadi, Head of Asia Pacific Research at BloombergNEF. Kemudian Profesor Puji Lestari dari Fakultas Sipil dan Teknik Lingkungan ITB. Kemudian yang berikutnya, yang keempat, Miss Chandana Sasidharan dari Alliance for Energy Efficient Economy India. Baik, untuk mempersingkat waktu, saya akan mengundang Miss Alison Pridmore dari International Energy Agency. Silakan.
Hi, Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Alison Pridmore and I'm the Transport Lead in the Energy Efficiency Division at the International Energy Agency, working on the Emerging Economies Programme. And I want to start by saying how pleased I am to be here today at this very important and very interesting virtual conference. It reflects the work we do with Indonesia. As Dr. Fatih Birol highlighted, the Indonesian Alliance is a key strategic initiative for us. It reflects energy efficiency, which is obviously a big passion of mine. It's a chance to reconnect, so I know some of the other panelists from a different time and a different space, and I think it's also time to sort of connect with new people and also really benefit from an actually fantastic programme over the next 3-4 days. My presentation is going to be reframed from the global perspective, reflecting the International Energy Agency's recent work on the roadmap to net zero. And this is highly relevant and highly important work. And it really also highlights the international nature of the challenge and the opportunities in terms of fuels, in terms of technologies, in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of behaviour change, which are all very much global in nature. So with no further ado, and with hopefully that this works, I'm going to share my screen. So we'll try and get it up. Okay. Can someone just flag to say, Ahmed, can you flag to say that you're seeing my screen okay? Yeah.
It's okay.
That's great.
Okay. Okay. So I start, as I was saying, it's going to be framed around the global perspective. In terms of what I'm going to cover I'm going to be 3 key themes. The first is where the transport sector is now. The second is really where the transport sector needs to be in terms of decarbonisation. Remember, this is at the global level. And then within this, I'm going to be really exploring the kind of contribution from different modes. I'm also reflecting the nature of the conference, really going to be talking quite a bit around energy efficiency and also around behaviour change. If there's time, I'll also touch upon, how the transport sector fits with other sectors. So I'm going to kick off. Globally, the transport sector emitted over 7 gigatons of CO2 in 2020. And as alluded to earlier, this is lower than the numbers from 2019, which was around 8.5 gigatons of CO2. In terms of emission reductions, our colleagues' analysis highlights that the reduction needs to be significant. So by 2030, we need to move from the 7.2 in 2020 to 5.5 gigatons. By 2050, transport across all modes needs to drop to 0.7 gigatons. And this is a 90% drop relative to 2020. The spread, and I think this is coming out in the sort of discussions and the points already made, it's not even across the modes. There's different levels of maturity. I mean, there's been this highlighting already about some of the role of electrification in this, and we know that electrification is a key opportunity for Indonesia in terms of its 2-wheeler fleet, in terms of its passenger light duty fleet. And the kind of analysis that the IEA did really also highlighted, maybe some of the challenges around the technology maturity for heavy trucks, shipping and aviation that are kind of emerging, but will take longer term to implement. The next slide also really sort of highlights the kind of, the importance of electrification sort of dynamic. We'll talk a bit more about energy efficiency in a second. So the number of electric 2- and 3-wheelers is estimated to rise from around 300 million today, with the majority of those electric wheelers today in China, to 600 million in 2030 and 1.2 billion in 2050. The number of battery electric, plug-in hybrid and fuel cell electric cars is estimated to reach 350 million in 2030 and almost 2 billion in 2050. And this is up from around 11 billion in 2020. Depending on the region, the electrification of these vehicles adopts slightly different patterns. The advanced economies have a slightly sort of faster adoption of electrified vehicles. Complementing this, and I was pleased to hear modal shift, the importance of modal shift mentioned earlier. The electric bus fleet expands from 0.5 million in 2020 to 8 million in 2030 to 50 million in 2050. So it really kind of highlights the importance of electrification across the sort of across the kind of different transport modes. As we know, electrification of heavy trucks moves more slowly because of weight of batteries, because of charging requirements, and because of limits on driving range. But it still makes a key proportion of sales in 2030 and 2050. So I'll jump ahead and I'll talk a bit more. And I was really sort of, the importance of energy efficiency in this context. And there are several reasons for this. We know that next decade really has to be a big decade of change, and many energy efficiency measures can be put into effect and scaled up very quickly. We know that this works, that we know that they're there. In the net zero report, they play the largest role in curbing, one of the largest roles in curbing energy demand and emissions to 2030. In terms of overall impact, this major worldwide push to increase energy efficiency is really seen as an essential part of these efforts and results in an annual energy intensity improvement of averaging 4% to 2030, about 3 times the average rate achieved in the last 2 decades. And I think these kind of sense of scale tied in with the points being made earlier. After 2030, they still play a key role, and especially, as I sort of mentioned earlier, to some of the sort of heavier technologies, shipping, aviation, the heavy trucks, where the kind of electrification technologies are still kind of being developed. It's also really important to note, and I was again, air quality, energy security, these are kind of key opportunities, these are kind of key kind of hooks in the short term as well to sort of take forward energy efficiency. We also know that they help reduce vulnerabilities of businesses and their consumers in terms of disruptions to potential energy supply. We'll talk briefly about the importance of behaviour change, and again, this refers to some of the modal shift. This refers to some of the opportunities in terms of avoidance of international travels, avoidance of business travel that were kind of again referenced in the discussion so far. So, the analysis for the IEA's net zero report really highlights that 55% of the emissions reductions require a mixture of deployment of low carbon technologies and the active involvement and engagement of citizens and consumers. And this kind of reflects the choice element in people moving to electric mobility, for example, that there's a consumer involvement in the choice of their type of car, the choice of their two-wheeler. So that's like a key, 55% of emission reductions involve some sort of consumer element, and 8% of behavioural change, 8% involves behavioural change or materials efficiency gains. And in the report we discuss about the role of moving towards electrified mobility in cities, the importance of ride sharing, the importance of walk and cycling, again from a carbon reduction perspective, but also from a quality of life perspective. So some of these sort of shorter term measures have kind of large scale impacts kind of across sustainability goals in terms of healthy access and healthier lifestyles, in terms of sort of the livability of neighbourhoods. Highlights the roles that kind of different some of kind of city-based options that are available that are sort of linked in the behaviour change discussion. And I'll probably just tab down, and I've got some of these slides, but the kind of sense of scale, again over time, this really highlights the role of rail, maritime, shipping and aviation, the kind of front loading of two-wheelers and three-wheelers and light duty vehicles in the sort of shorter term, the role of electrification of rail, and the kind of sort of longer term planning needs for maritime shipping and aviation in terms of their decarbonisation. I think if okay, I'll finish there. I'm open to questions, or Ahmed, if you wanted to have all the panelists and we kind of have a broader discussion once we've all had our say. I know other panelists are going to talk to the two-wheelers energy efficiency, so it might be interesting to pull that all together when done. Stop sharing.
Ya, terima kasih. Tadi baru saja kita menyimak apa yang sudah disampaikan oleh Miss Alison terkait dengan global perspektif energi efisiensi. Tadi juga sudah disampaikan terkait dengan tren dari global trend terkait dengan peningkatan efisiensi dari penggunaan energi dengan tahun 2030 dan 2050. Ada beberapa hal dalam upaya mencapai tren increasing of energy efficiency, misalnya dengan perubahan perilaku, penggunaan teknologi yang lebih efisien, selain juga penggunaan energi yang jauh lebih baik atau lebih bersih. Baik, kita akan lanjut ke panelis berikutnya, yaitu Bapak Ali Izadi dari Head of Asia Pacific Research, BloombergNEF. Kami persilakan Pak Ali Izadi.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for giving the opportunity for me to speak to you today. It's my pleasure to share with you our latest annual electric vehicle outlook report that was just published last week. This is a report that our team, collaboration between various analysts across the world, put together every year. Dr. Pridmore already talked to you a bit about the reduction in emission required across different modes of transport. So what I will do is primarily focus on road vehicles and give you where we see the transition taking place in an economic fashion and where do we need to be if we want to be compliant with a 2-degree pathway. The approach that we take in this outlook is we look at all demand for road vehicles. So we look at how demographics and economic factors play into increasing demand for both personal mobility as well as fleet demand for road vehicles. We then look at the different drivetrain applications as well as the role of shared mobility and autonomy. As I mentioned earlier, the outlook covers everything from two-wheelers to cars, vans, commercial vehicles, and buses. We also look at the implications of the outlook for energy demand as well as material demand. The report itself is quite long. If you're interested in it, please do feel free to search for BNEF Evo and you'll be able to find a public excerpt of it. In the next 10 minutes, I'll try to share with you the main results. Before I do that, just a clarification around how the modeling is done. In the short term, and what I mean by the short term is between now and 2025, we do a bottom-up analysis of consumer behavior, existing buying trends in particular, looking at policies that are already in place, as well as corporate activities. That allows us to come out with an outlook out to 2025. Beyond that, we consider two scenarios. One scenario is looking at purely driven from an economic perspective and where economics take into account the limitations of known technologies can take us. The other scenario is, what if we want to achieve net zero by 2050? For the short term, we are seeing acceleration of electrification of mobilities across different modes of road transport. For passenger vehicles, we are already at a fleet of over 12 million globally. China has been leading the world since 2016, but last year in particular, we saw significant growth in Europe, and we are seeing now more and more activities all around the world, including Southeast Asia. On that note, for Southeast Asia, we see a lot of potential for two-wheelers and electric buses. So far, again, these are areas where China has led the world. So as Dr. Pridmore also mentioned earlier, 40% of electric two-wheeler sales globally are already electric. But as you can see on the chart on the rightmost side, majority of that right now is in China. But we are seeing a lot of adoption now taking place in Southeast Asia, particularly in Vietnam. What's driving electric vehicle sales in the short term, particularly in the car segment, is of course policies. Many countries have provided generous subsidies. So last year, the sales increase in Europe was significantly driven by additional subsidies provided as part of green stimulus measures. But in addition to subsidies, a lot of jurisdictions are moving towards regulating emissions. So again, in the case of Europe, it was also the impact of the new tailpipe emission standards that came into effect from last year, and they're going to be ratcheting it up towards 2030. The other important factor is, of course, the cost of the vehicles themselves, and here is the cost of lithium-ion batteries that's very important. Over the last decade, we've seen almost 90% reduction in the average price of lithium-ion battery packs used by EVs, and we expect this trend to continue. Unfortunately, I won't be able to go into a lot of the bottom-up analysis, but if you look at it from a top-down perspective, the learning rate for lithium-ion battery packs for EVs has been 18% historically. That means on average, every time deployed volume doubled, prices declined by 18%. And we expect this trend to continue. So that means by around 2024, we are looking at pack level prices below $100 per kilowatt hour, and then by 2030, below $60 per kilowatt hour. Now, these prices might seem very aggressive, and certainly with known lithium-ion battery technologies, getting to around $70 per kilowatt hour is already feasible, although it's still challenging. Beyond that, certainly some breakthroughs are needed, but again, we see a lot of investment as well as innovation already happening, which gives us confidence that these prices will be achievable. If you take into account this price outlook, then purely based on economics, by 2040, we are looking at just under 70% of passenger vehicle sales being electric. If you take into account the contribution from passenger fuel cell vehicles as well as hybrid vehicles, and here by hybrid I mean strong hybrids, so hybrid vehicles that have a traction motor on board, then we are looking at over 80% of new vehicle sales being much more efficient than conventional internal combustion engine vehicles. Of course, the adoption rate by geography is very different already. If you look at, as I mentioned earlier, China and Europe are already way ahead of the rest of the world, and by 2025, we expect these two regions to be above 20% rate of adoption, primarily because of the policies that they already have in place. There are other markets like Canada and South Korea, which are also accelerating quite fast. In Southeast Asia, so far in the passenger vehicle segment, we have seen limited adoption, and most of this has been in the luxury segment, particularly plug-in hybrids in places such as Malaysia and Thailand, where there have been tax incentives in place. But we are seeing more and more automakers make launch plans for the region as well. And of course, any new regulatory measures that support the adoption of EVs will also push up these adoption rates in the short term. Longer term, again, China and Europe are likely to lead. The US, which has been lagging a little bit for the past few years, we do expect to see a resurgence of EV adoption in the US. Primarily due to two factors. One is the American automakers are ramping up their targets, but also the economics for EV adoption in the US is actually quite favorable. For the rest of the world, depending on the market, adoption may take a little bit longer. So for example, in markets that are very price sensitive, this means much of Southeast Asia, but also India, where the average purchase vehicle price is below $10,000 US, then we have to wait until battery prices get a lot cheaper. Of course, the caveat here is that we can have small battery electric vehicles that can be priced quite competitively. Already, if you look at China, the most popular model is actually not a luxury model. It's actually a model that starts at a price of below $5,000 US. It's a compact battery electric vehicle produced by a joint venture between GM, SAIC, and Wuling. That kind of model, if it's expanded to more geographies, then you can see these adoption rates actually accelerate. For Southeast Asia, we do see EV adoption accelerating in passenger vehicles in the 30s. For two-wheelers, though, we see actually as being a bigger driver for electrification in the region. For two-wheelers, already the economics is quite favorable. It's more a question of model availability. In Vietnam, where model availability in the past couple of years has improved, you've seen significant increase in sales. If that's expanded to more markets, we expect the same thing to happen there. On the commercial vehicle side, for light-duty commercial vehicles, similarly, battery prices as well as their performance are good enough. So we're seeing a ramp-up of adoption of electric vehicles in that segment. As we go to heavier duty segments, particularly for applications where you're trying to carry heavy weights over long distances, then there are some challenges with energy and power density of batteries as well as charging times. However, even in these areas, we're seeing a lot of improvements. We're seeing particularly for urban duty cycles, even heavy duty vehicles going electric. For much longer distances, this is where the opportunity for fuel cells lies. Now, if you take this economic transition scenario, the good news is it means that for road vehicles, we're looking at emissions peaking by 2030 and then declining by 2050. But the challenge is this trend is not aligned with where we need to be if you want to achieve a 2-degree pathway or if you want to achieve net zero by 2050. So what we did is we modeled a scenario of what would we need to do to achieve net zero by 2050, and that essentially means we have to accelerate sales much earlier. If you want your fleet to be zero tailpipe emission by 2050, for example, in the passenger segment, you have to make sure that already sales by 2035 are already net zero emission. This is a bit challenging. It also requires considering the energy and materials implications of that. And I will briefly share with you some of those implications. The first one is around electricity demand. What this slide is showing you on the leftmost is electricity demand from the results of the economic transition scenario. The middle is the net zero scenario. This is just from road vehicles. And then the final one is if we take into account the electricity demand for charging electric vehicles as part of the total electricity demand globally. If you look at the 2050 number for the ETS scenario, this is just around 5,000 terawatt hours. This is roughly, you can think about it as 5 times Japan's current demand. If you look at the NZS, it's about 65% higher than this number. But if you look at both of these numbers in reflection of the total global electricity demand by 2050, even in the net zero scenario, we're only talking about an addition of 25% of electricity demand in 2050. It is notable, but it's doable. What's more critical is when and where the charging happens. Under where the charging happens, these are the results for the economic transition scenario. We expect we're going to need about 320 million charge points. Just under 80% of that is going to be at home or workplaces for charging passenger vehicles. Most of the passenger vehicle fleet is going to get charged at home or at a destination, such as the workplace. And for these charging at normal speeds is good enough. For public charging, again, majority of the street public charging can be done at normal levels. Certainly for some particular locations, for example, highways, having fast chargers or ultra fast chargers will be helpful. Where we really need fast chargers is much more for commercial vehicles and buses, where the charging time is very important. If you look at this in comparison to the net zero scenario, in the net zero scenario, we need to go above 700 million charge points, so significantly higher. And then in terms of investment, we almost have to double the amount of investment required in charging infrastructure. But if you look at the cumulative investment required to achieve that scenario, this is equivalent to the world roughly spending about 0.05% of GDP per year on this infrastructure. Again, notable, but doable. For reference, by the way, we are already spending more per year on telecommunication infrastructure everywhere. What about battery demand? And this is where things get a little bit trickier. So if you look at the economic transition scenario, you already see that by 2035, you're talking about annual demand of about 5 terawatt-hour. For your reference, by the way, last year's battery demand was just around 240 gigawatt-hour, and this includes all applications. We're not talking about just passenger vehicles. From a cell production, when we look at investments that battery manufacturers are making, it's still, when we look at the timelines that are already foreseeable by 2025, cell production is not an issue. What's an issue is whether we have the raw material that's needed. And to project the raw material, we have to consider the different lithium-ion battery chemistries or even alternative chemistries that can be used. Without going into too much of those detailed chemistries, I'll try to give you the punchline in terms of looking at the raw material reserves that are already known versus the demand that's required for these scenarios. In these charts, the lines are in terms of supply and the bars are in terms of demand. The blue bar is the economic transition scenario. For the net zero scenario, we've done two additional scenarios. One is the green one, which is our conventional chemistry mix, and then the other one where we consider some novel chemistries coming into play. If you look at for lithium, without discovering any more new reserves, the amount of lithium reserves already known is probably good enough to cover us until mid-2040s. But beyond that, it wouldn't be enough. You would basically run out of the lithium that we require. Of course, if we start recycling, then it's not an issue. The other thing that we can do is we can actually switch to chemistries that require less lithium. And again, you can see that the yellow bar there is a bit shorter than the green one. For cobalt, it's a similar story, except if we actually go to these progressive chemistries, so this means, for example, trying to use more lithium iron phosphate, which has zero dependence on cobalt, or use more novel chemistries that are still in development, like cathode chemistries using iron fluoride, then we can completely reduce that cobalt dependence. For nickel, which is a big opportunity for Indonesia, we see that, again, in terms of reserves, we are okay until early 2040s. But beyond that, if we particularly rely on heavy nickel chemistries, as many automakers are considering, so for example, nickel manganese cobalt or nickel cobalt aluminum or nickel manganese cobalt aluminum, then we're going to run into some challenges. Here again, recycling can definitely help, but also considering some of these other novel chemistries can be quite helpful. On the manganese side, you can see that there's not much of an issue. Actually, manganese reserves are quite readily. The amount that's available is actually far more than demand currently. Now, the main message from here is not that this is easy. The message here is that from a purely material reserve side, we're probably okay. But this requires significant investment in new mining. Bringing these mines online will, of course, take time and it requires investment. But also, it goes back to the point that Dr. Pridmore also mentioned around considering the most efficient use of modes of transport. So if we convert all our vehicles today somehow magically to electric vehicles, that's probably not the best way to achieve emission reduction. If you think about, for example, for personal mobility, again, particularly in cities, thinking about urban planning, considering policies that prioritize active modes of transport, such as bicycling, walking, and public transit, are much more effective than giving subsidies to consumers for electric vehicles. Thank you very much for your attention.
Baik, tadi kita sudah menyimak bersama apa yang disampaikan oleh Mr. Izadi. Tadi disampaikan yang pertama, saat ini akan dimulai dengan dominasi dari China dalam rangka untuk EV adoption atau electric vehicle adoption. Kemudian berikutnya adalah EU dan yang ketiga adalah US atau Amerika Serikat. Nah, tadi juga disampaikan bahwa harga dari baterai pack itu akan terus menurun sehingga ke depan harga baterai ini akan jauh lebih murah sehingga ini akan memberikan kesempatan dalam rangka adopsi electric vehicle jauh lebih cepat lagi. Berikutnya tadi disampaikan ada global trend dalam rangka dalam hal passenger cars ya, terutama dalam hal selling atau penjualan. Sekalipun saat ini masih didominasi oleh ICE teknologi, tapi ada peluang bahwa ke depan electric vehicle juga akan terus meningkat sehingga pada tahun tertentu menjelang 2050 electric vehicle ini akan semakin mendominasi market. Yang ketiga tadi disampaikan terkait dengan market share ya secara global. Kalau saat ini ternyata EU relatif tertinggi dalam hal market share dikaitkan dengan beberapa jenis teknologi kendaraan bermotor. Kemudian yang kedua market share ini adalah di Cina dan yang ketiga di Kanada. Berikutnya negara-negara lain mengikuti dengan proporsi atau persentase yang lebih kecil untuk electric vehicle-nya. Disampaikan juga untuk charging infrastructure itu juga menjadi isu, namun demikian ada beberapa usulan atau katakan semacam inisiatif ke depannya agar charging infrastructure ini tidak menjadi masalah lagi dalam rangka untuk adopsi electric vehicle ini. Untuk baterai demand, jelas tadi sudah diproyeksikan bahwa ke depan ini juga akan semakin meningkat ya seiring dengan tingginya demand untuk electric vehicle ini. Dan ada beberapa teknologi tadi disampaikan terkait dengan baterai ini, misalnya ada lithium baterai, kobalt, nikel, mangan. Nah itu semua akan diadopsi sedemikian rupa dan kemungkinan akan berganti dari waktu ke waktu tergantung dari situasi keekonomian dari bahan baku untuk baterai electric vehicle tadi. Baik, selanjutnya kita undang Profesor Puji Lestari menyampaikan paparannya. Silakan, Prof.
Can you see my slide? Can you hear me and slide?
Bagus, sudah
okay?
the screen.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, all right. You put, it's my great honor to be here in this panels, and so today I would like to address the understanding urban mobility to support decarbonization and air pollution co-benefits, because it's actually cannot be separated. When you do also the decarbonization, it means also have some co-benefit with the air pollution. So that's why here I'm addressing the decarbonization and air pollution co-benefits. Well, why is it important? Because I'm talking about the urban. It's important because according to the C40 report, in the % of global greenhouse gas emissions, and this share will increase as the world becomes increasingly urban. And also, as a previous speaker says, the transportation sector share more than 30% to greenhouse gas emission in most urban area, including Jakarta, and Greater Jakarta. So today I'm going to address more on Jakarta studies, and also addressing transport sector, of course, could significantly reducing carbon emission in urban area. Understanding urban mobility demand could provide information for infrastructure development, policy initiative development, which lead to reducing carbon emission from transport sector. Well, I will start with the energy consumption. In Indonesia, about 40% energy is consumed by transportation sectors. And if we go to the urban areas like Jakarta or road transport consume about 33% of the total energy in Jakarta, according to the Indonesian International Communication under UNFCCC. In 2017, transport sector in Indonesia contribute 23. Well, the energy consumption, I think, has been previously mentioned by speakers and also plenary in the first plenary. That's the energy consumption directly related to the carbon emissions. So I would like also to show our carbon emissions based on our emission inventory project, calculated using GINS model. So we actually working with the IASA in Austria on doing this emission inventory. And we also can see here in like 2020, the road transport share about 33% of the carbon emission in Jakarta. So the increasing of this carbon emission from 2015 to 2030, it's going to increase if there is no policy intervention or there is no control strategy. Then the emission from transport, of course, will be going up each year. And then out of the 33%, actually, what type of vehicles that has high contribution to this 33%? So if I'm looking at this emission, actually the light-duty vehicle, gasolines or passenger cars, actually, and also motorcycle has quite high contribution to the carbon emission in Jakarta. So still up to 2030 if there is no intervention. So this is actually business as usual scenario, which is from 2015 to 2030. That's still the first. Is if I look at this light-duty vehicles, gasoline contribute about 40% to the total emission from the transportation. Motorcycles as actually maybe the different with the other country. Indonesia has so many motorcycles or motorbikes. Almost 70% of the total fleet vehicles in Jakarta as well as in Indonesia is come from motorbike or motorcycle. So we have quite high population of motorcycle in Indonesia as well. So we also can see that light-duty vehicles, as we call also passenger car, contribute about 40%, motorcycle 34%, and then the third larger is the heavy-duty vehicle. And then if we addressing this type of vehicles for the energy efficiency or for the carbon emission, will certainly could reduce quite significant emission of carbon in transport sector. For the decarbonization from transport sector, we actually evaluating a few of the implementation, but there is actually several decarbonization from transport. It has been previously mentioned by our previous speakers. There is electrification vehicle adoptions, switching fossil fuel to biofuel is also very important. And then there is also improving fuel economy. It's also very important. Switching transport mode from private car to public transport. But I only will address the two, evaluating the electrification vehicle adoption and switching fossil fuel to biofuel. Well, to implement this one, we need to understand the urban travel demands. As also we've been knowing that currently in Indonesia, almost all transport activities are still depend on fossil fuel power engines. It's still not yet, the EV is still, the number of EV is still very, very small in Indonesia. And also to implement that, we need to understand the high energy vehicle days, travel patterns in Indonesia, which could provide information for infrastructure development plan, such as the colleagues, the previous colleagues from Hyundai already mentioned about the infrastructure. So I think this is very important to understand the travel behavior, the urban travel need to support the infrastructure development. And this one is actually we evaluating the carbon emission reduction for implementation of EV and B30, because currently in Indonesia we still implement B30, and since 2020, if we can see that if this blue one here is the business as usual, there is no intervention, and then if right now implement B30 in Indonesia by 2020, last year start, and then by 2030, actually it could reduce about 4.2% carbon emission in Jakarta. And then the implementation of EV will be in 2025, and by 2030, actually, this also could contribute in carbon emission reduction up to about 9.8% decrease. So this one is the our project from emission inventory, and the electrical vehicle adoption actually could be potentially reduce carbon emission in Jakarta. Combining EV and B30 could be also a potential option. I think it could be possible option for the future, because for the transition, especially for the transition period right now. And as I just mentioned, that energy efficiency implementation of EV is not just reducing the carbon emission, but it also could be air pollution reduction as well. And this is being the co-benefit of doing the energy efficiency and doing also the EV implementation. Then also could reduce the PM 2.5, could reduce the SO2, SOx in Indonesia, and also in Jakarta, especially in other urban area. Also NOx and then CO also can be reduced by implementing the EV in Indonesia, not only carbon. Well, actually, we also need to consider, as I just mentioned, that travel need, urban travel need is very, very important to support this decarbonization, for electrification, and also for the biofuel, because we need to really understand the high energy days, the energy distribution, which is this using energy trip model. Actually was developed by MIT with Professor Transik at MIT, and then right now ITB, MIT and ITB is also in collaboration, but is still in the initial stage to work on this project to identify the energy distribution. But then actually the travel survey, as I just mentioned, it's very important. It's very needed to have this survey, and then we could identify the travel demand, urban travel need by residents, like urban resident travel needs, activities and modes, share, trip distance, high energy vehicle days, trip purpose, mode preference. This is also very important to be identified in order to provide the right infrastructure. This one is based on our survey. Actually, this is also still initial survey with about 500 respondents. That we also need to understand the travel frequencies of residents, which is about more than 50% people or residents in Jakarta and Greater Jakarta travel more than 300 kilometers once to 5 times in a year, and even travel 300 to 600 kilometers about even 6 to 10 times. So this is very high demand in long distance travel. And then we also know that if this travel ring of fully charged EV, if the EV will be implemented, and then we know if the travel ring of fully charged EV is less than 300 kilometers, EV will be less favorable for the long trip, unless there is an infrastructure for charging in between. So if we could provide the charging in between or infrastructure for charging, then maybe become favorable, because otherwise, because people travel more than 300 kilometers up to 600 and then even more than that. And then for the shortened distance, this is for respondents who never travel long distance, but most of them, like about 50%, people traveling using the car for 100 to 200 kilometers. And this trip that can be accommodated by a fully charged electric vehicles without charging in between the trip. So this was very important to understand the behavior, the travel behavior of the residents, so that we could provide infrastructure. And then this one, I think I will just to skip. This is very similar, but this one up to 1,000 kilometers. So our survey up to 1,000 kilometers, but mostly people are traveling for long distance, 1,000 kilometers. They prefer to have airplane or trains, but up to 600, they usually still using private car. So that's why it is just passing this one. And this one is the understanding the trip purpose is also very important. We have to understand what is the trip purpose. So about 70% from our survey, this is we separated between a motorcycle and cars. About 70% for both motorcycle and car are mostly used for work and for shopping. So this the second one is for shopping. So maybe shopping for food, not necessarily shopping for something else, not clothes, but maybe for food. So it's 70% both motorcycle and car are mostly used for work, but the third higher for motorcycle is for school. So a lot of people using motorcycle for a school, they're going to school. For car, the third higher was for recreation. So understanding the travel behavior, understanding the trips, the trip purposes, we could provide a good infrastructure to fulfill the residents' travel needs. So this is very important, and this one, of course, if we could provide the infrastructure, a good infrastructure, then we could support the decarbonization in the long term. I think it's my last conclusion because it's short. They said we need to prepare on 10 slides, so I tried to prepare 10 slides. It is difficult, so I have more than 10 slides, little bit. And then the conclusion: transport sector shares significant carbon emission in urban area, and then education of vehicles, car and motorcycle could potentially reduce carbon emission in urban area, as well as air pollution co-benefits. Identifying would be main high energy vehicle day, trip purpose, trip distance, and preference could provide information for infrastructure development and support decarbonization. Transition period toward the decarbonization should be well planned. Combining vehicle electrification and biofuel may be an option for transition periods. So because we cannot just suddenly change to electrification vehicles, maybe still need a very long time. In the meantime, if we could switching the fuel from the fossil fuel to biofuel, they also could reduce quite a lot of the carbon emission. So I think that's my conclusion. So this one actually project team, MIT in Indonesia. The Indonesia have Professor Harun Al Rashid is also here, I think, and also it's our team from ITB, and we are also team from MIT, Professor Jessica Tranchik, and also her team is here. I would like to acknowledge this this project research. This work was partially supported by the Ministry of Education through MIRA program under World Class University Seed Fund managed by ITB, and also other funding support was under TCAP from TMC Japan for Asian countries. So I would like to acknowledge that, and thank you very much.
Baik, terima kasih Profesor Puji atas paparannya yang sangat menarik ya. Tadi disampaikan ada beberapa hal yang sempat saya catat. Yang pertama, transportasi menyumbangkan emisi karbon dioksida yang sangat signifikan di urban areas. Kemudian yang kedua, transportasi masih didominasi IC teknologi, di mana saat ini EV atau electric vehicle masih sangat terbatas. Kemudian yang ketiga tadi perlu diterapkan kebijakan co-benefit ya, air pollution sekaligus dalam rangka memitigasi climate change atau greenhouse gas. Mungkin perlu ditambahkan juga Prof, tidak hanya co-benefit sekarang ini, mungkin triple benefit ya. Artinya selain air pollution, climate change, dan yang berikutnya adalah konteksnya sekaligus dalam rangka untuk mendorong economic growth, atau dengan kata lain ada economic benefit.
Yes. Correct.
Adalah digunakan untuk bekerja, dan ini menggambarkan bahwa memang masih relatif buruknya fasilitas mass public transport yang aman, nyaman, dan terjadwal dengan baik, sehingga orang ke tempat kerja harus mengandalkan kendaraan pribadi, baik sepeda motor atau mobil tadi ya. Saya pikir itu yang disampaikan Profesor Puji tadi, termasuk apa yang simpulkan tadi, ada beberapa rekomendasi yang tentu sangat menarik untuk diteruskan kepada pemerintah. Berikutnya, Ms. Chandana Sasidharan dari Alliance for Energy Efficient Economy India, kami persilakan.
Hi everybody. I have requested my colleague Varun to share the slides which I will be presenting. It's a good point for me to start because we have been talking about electric vehicles, and especially the electric 2- and 3-wheelers in particular, which is an identity of the South Asia and Southeast Asia, and India is also true to that. I come from an organization called Alliance for an Energy Efficient Economy. We are an industry platform and a research think tank based out in India, and we do a lot sort of work work on policy advocacy for energy efficiency. And what I want to present in front of you is an initiative that we are spearheading in India, which is a consumer information tool for shift towards clean mobility. This is a tool in which we have focused more on the two-wheelers, both the ICE vehicles as well as the electric vehicles. Varun, can we go to the next slide? We all have been vocal about air pollution. In India also, it has been reported in 2020 that 22 out of world's most polluted cities are in India. So this is a cause for concern, and need for clean transportation is increasing as our cities and we are buying more and more vehicles. Even though from the scale of the vehicles, a two-wheeler looks like it is less polluting than perhaps a heavy-duty truck, we still need to consider them, especially when we are talking about India and Southeast Asia, and we need to think about the health and environmental impacts these vehicles are going to find. If I look at the statistics for India, we can actually see that transportation sector is the third highest contributor for carbon dioxide emission. The leading contributor is actually the power sector, as you can see in the next slide. Varun, can we go to the next slide? So, why do we believe two-wheelers, why did we pick two-wheelers as the basis of our study? Two-wheelers actually constitute 80% of on-road vehicles in India. We are currently undergoing a transition. This is something a lot of you might also be aware of. Similar to the Euro standards, India has standards called as Bharat 4 and Bharat 6, which we are currently promoting in India. And actually in 2020, amid the pandemic, we did the transition. As on April 2020, the vehicles that we could sell in India need to suit to the higher standard, which is the Bharat 6 standard, which is a pretty strong emission standard for ICE vehicles. Whereas particularly in the two-wheeler segment, we are seeing this penetration of electric vehicles increase in India. And why do we see this case? Because it is not just about private ownership cases. A lot of commercial use cases have evolved for electric variants in India. People like Domino's, people like Flipkart, Amazon, a lot of delivery services, food and logistics services, all of them are relying on electric vehicles, and some companies have even taken goals for 100% electrification of fleets. And two-wheeler is going to be the mainstay of those fleets, because we all know, because anybody from Southeast Asia or South Asia can understand, there are roads in South Asia where a two-wheeler can easily travel, wherein a commercial vehicle, commercial delivery vehicle cannot easily approach. And what we see in India is that the pace of adoption of electric two-wheelers are increasing quite faster. Varun, can you please keep on clicking? Don't wait for me. All right. So we have, in our study, we have looked at two pollutants. One is the criteria pollutants, the NOx, CO, hydrocarbon, as well as the PM, and the greenhouse gases. And the figure on the right side shows you all the impacts that we are aware of as a global community from the impact of vehicular pollution. Go to the next slide, Varun. Click. Yeah. Go back. Yeah. So what we did is we designed a tool called as the Green Vehicle Rating. This is a tool, an information tool to nudge the consumers. Why do we believe this is relevant? Because a consumer, we are enabling a consumer to make a choice based on awareness. We have a large set of people who are emerging amongst us who are very climate conscious. So this is a rating system which enables rating of our vehicles based on environmental performance. We are able to go beyond the norms of fuel efficiency alone. And we are able to bring in this criteria also into their minds of how can they also quantify what is the cost of health and what is the cost of environment for vehicular emission when it brings out. We did the first iteration of green vehicle rating in 2019. Therein we were focused on internal combustion engine. gap that we need to bridge. How do we explain to them in a language that the consumer can understand? And I believe one of the simplest possible way to put it in, like rupees per kilometer, it can be dollars per kilometer. So how do you try to do it as you put it in your local currency per kilometer, which is in terms of something the consumer can understand. We truly believe that such measures, apart from all the policy measures that are available, the incentives, the tax benefits for cleaner vehicle models, can also help drive a demand shift towards cleaner options. Here we are being very transparent, and we are actually bringing the spotlights on the high performing models of vehicles, be it within the entire ICE category or be it within the entire electric vehicle category. And this can enable a shift towards more cleaner models of vehicles, and it will support all the government initiatives towards more efficient and less polluting models. Energy efficiency is embedded into our GVR methodology because fuel efficiency is one of the bases wherein the amount of pollutants will be determined for the vehicle. Can we go to the next slide, Varun? So how do we source the information for these vehicles? So one of the forms that is available, this was actually also a tool that was developed for consumer information. We have a tool in India called as Roadworthiness Certificate, commonly called as the Form 22. This was actually introduced in 2017. It is mandated. It is one of the forms that the vehicle manufacturer submits to the dealer. I have put in a sample of the form for you to see, and you can actually see that it actually brings out gram per kilometer or gram per kilowatt per hour is how they are providing the values for the pollutants that is coming out from a particular vehicle. Now, what is the problem with current Form 22? For the consumer, either they are unaware of this Form 22, because this information is not passed on to the consumer, and secondly, the way it is represented, as I explained previously, they are not able to make a purchase decision based on that, because this is in terms of gram per kilometer. Nobody has actually converted that into a cost basis that the consumer can understand. And the auto dealers are unwilling to disclose or share the forms also. This is also something that we are seeing in the market. Go to the next slide, Varun. So we had to design a methodology which will enable us to account for the emissions from both ICE vehicles as well as electric vehicles. Typically, when you are looking at the emissions from an ICE vehicle, we do the tailpipe emission method, and electric vehicles have zero tailpipe emissions. Particularly in a country like India, where power plant emissions are still significant at this point, though we are decarbonizing very fastly, when we promote EV as a clean alternative, we need to be very confident about the calculations that we do. Hence, it became critical for us to design a method that will help compare impacts from both during the production, distribution and storage for both ICE vehicles and electric vehicles. If I have to give you an estimate, I can say that for an ICE vehicle, what is calculated during the tailpipe emission phase represents only a minor fraction, roughly 45% of the emissions that will come from the vehicle, whereas what is used in the energy production, distribution and storage would represent the remaining section, that is the other 45% of the emissions. So we are able to capture almost 90% of the emissions in this cycle. For electric vehicles, the energy production, distribution and storage is going to account for 80% of the emissions. So in this case, if we are using our methodology, which we are calling as plant to wheel emissions methodology, we are able to capture 90% emissions of the ICE train and as well as 80% emissions of the electric vehicle train. Why am I stressing on the methodology is because Southeast Asia is also moving more towards clean mobility and even electric vehicles. And this would actually, the methodology is perhaps the message I should bring out to the table today. And this is a compounded methodology that can help us calculate both petroleum refinery emissions and the thermal power plant emissions in the case of electric vehicles, and to factor in and bring it out as a consumer awareness tool. Varun, go to the next slide. So in simple terms, what do we try to do? We try to take out the emissions impact. We look at it from two perspectives. One is the health impact and the environmental impact. Then we convert it into what is called as the damage cost, health cost and environment cost. And this is something that we can actually bring on to and provide what is called as the real cost of ownership. I'm sure that a lot of people in the panel and a lot of participants are aware of what true cost of ownership of a vehicle is, which includes both operating costs as well as the capital cost for the vehicle. And here, how we are defining the real cost of ownership of a vehicle is in you add to the true cost of ownership what is the environmental and health cost of owning the vehicle as well. And based on the cost, we arrive at what is called as the damage score and as well as the health rating and environmental rating of the vehicle, and which actually forms our green vehicle rating. Why don't we go to the next slide? Click again. So how are we doing this rating? We take 5 steps. One is the data collection steps. We calculate data on the criteria, pollutants, GHG emissions, vehicle specifications, etc. The next portion is actually quantifying the emissions impact, as I explained, in terms of health impact and environmental impact. Next portion is for us is monetization. We are monetizing the vehicle emission using marginal damage cost method. And we are putting the environmental cost as well as any economic benefits in straightforward information, which is rupee per kilometer. We are also using the social cost of carbon method to convert the impact from GHGs to monetize them. Next major aspect for us is the normalization of the vehicle. Here is something that we have adopted in our methodology. We don't use the same vehicle to normalize both ICE vehicles and electric vehicles. And even within ICE vehicles, people from South Asia and Indonesia particularly can relate to it. We have scooters and we have motorbikes. They have different engine capacity, they have different fuel efficiency, they perform differently. So what we have done is both ICE vehicles and electric vehicles, we have classified them into slabs based on engine size and battery capacity, and a reference vehicle is basically coming from the slab of the vehicle that our vehicle can correlate to. The reference vehicle is the best existing clean model in the slab. This is an existing vehicle. This is not a normative vehicle, and based on the best fuel efficiency and lowest criteria pollutant emissions, we are normalizing the vehicles. And finally, we are calculating the score, as I explained earlier, the damage score as well as the real cost of ownership. Varun, can we go to the next slide? So for the health impact, we consider the impact from CO, hydrocarbons, NOx, PM 2.5 and SOx. The environmental costs are classified from 3 major aspects: the losses that happens to the crops, the agriculture in particular, what is the impact on visibility, and third, what is the impact of climate change. To consider the losses of crops, we are considering HC and NOx. For the visibility impact, we are taking the PM10, NOx, hydrocarbon and SOx. And for climate change impact, we are considering CO2, CH4 and N2O. This was a consideration we added because in a methodology, we wanted to elaborate it to consider if there is any diesel vehicle as well. And these are our major calculation steps. The composite damage cost comes from the health cost and environmental cost. The health rating comes from dividing the health cost of vehicle to the health cost of reference vehicle. The same manner for calculating the environmental rating. Then we are calculating the damage score. For this year's GVR, we have given 60% weightage to health rating and 40% weightage to environmental cost. This was a consideration that came from consultation with stakeholders. This is not a normative approach, and any country can consider any type of approach. And based on the damage score, we are assigning the rating in a scale of 1 to 5. And finally, as I also said, we can also calculate the real cost of ownership of a vehicle, factoring in what is the total cost of ownership of the vehicle as well as the composite damage cost. Varun, can we go to the next slide? So the GVR results, this is how do we take it to consumers? What we have done is we have developed a website for consumers with different filters, as you can see, which will help the consumer to pick out which vehicles are performing better. This is separated for both ICE vehicles and electric vehicles. Varun, go to the next slide. So finally, why am I here and I'm emphasizing on green vehicle rating as a methodology? We can definitely provide a lot of incentive. We can provide a lot of policy support, including tax benefits and rebates, parking charge reductions. But we truly believe behavioral aspect and behavioral nudges is one of the effective ways to shift towards efficient and a cleaner transport. And we need to provide information to consumers to make purchase decision in a language that they can understand, which is in the simplest term as rupee per kilometer. And GVR in this case can boost the implementation and effectiveness for all governmental-led efforts that are there for clean mobility right now. And from the overarching perspective, a simple initiative like this can be the enabler of SDG 7, SDG 12, and SDG 13. I wanted to iterate two examples on how GVR can also fit into the policy framework. I hope everybody understands the concept of fee-based. This is based on the polluter-based principle, as in we are penalizing a heavy polluter to support the cost barrier for a technology such as electric vehicles, which is less polluting. And how do you actually identify the more polluting vehicles in this model? Perhaps GVR could be an effective tool that can be used to identify who deserves support and who should be actually penalized. And this is a method that has been tested and tried out in the larger regions in the world. So this is one of the recommendations that we have on how we can implement such consumer information tools into policy making. And also think of composite labeling systems. Standards and labeling programs are quite popular ways of energy efficiency improvement in countries including India. In India, we have what is called as a 5-star program. 1 star represents the lower end of energy efficiency and the 5-star is the best in the class. And a large set of appliances are included in this condition now. And there is a plan in India right now to include electric vehicles also into this mix. So be it an ICE vehicle, be it an electric vehicle, bringing out simple star ratings are also a way of making the consumer understand which one to pick quite well, because this is a simple and most effective tool. And we truly believe that since our method is deriving from the fuel economy of the vehicle as well as the emissions profile, we need to do standards and labeling not just based on fuel efficiency, but we need to bring in environment as well as health aspect into it, and we can bring up a better rating system. This is where I'm ending. So please feel free to reach out to us. Though our results are for India, our methodology we believe is something that can be used globally, especially in countries which has high two-wheeler usage. This is not a method just for two-wheelers. We can also extend it to other vehicle models, our three-wheelers as well as four-wheelers. But I just wanted to bring the message to all of you. Thank you.
Oke, terima kasih banyak Ms. Chandana untuk presentasinya, sangat menarik. Tadi disampaikan beberapa hal, ternyata tipikalnya hampir sama, transportasi di India yang juga didominasi oleh two-wheeler ya, roda 2, seperti halnya di Indonesia. Tapi sesuatu yang menarik tadi, Barat 6 akan segera diterapkan tadi di India, sementara kita masih jauh tertinggal. Kita baru Euro 4, itu pun baru bensin pada tahun 2018 yang lalu. Nah, yang menarik tadi yang disampaikan yang terakhir cukup panjang penjelasannya, green vehicle rating. Nah, sebenarnya kita 2003 kita pernah menerapkan itu ya dengan vehicle emission and fuel economy mandatory disclosure, tetapi kemudian di Indonesia itu diberhentikan pada tahun 2009. GVR, Green Vehicle Rating, ini adalah sesuatu yang sangat menarik dalam rangka mendorong masyarakat untuk lebih memilih kendaraan yang green, yang lebih bersih. Kalau masyarakat sudah memilih, tentu yang akan meningkatkan demand terhadap green vehicle. Tadi yang disampaikan Miss Chandana seperti ini. Artinya dengan peningkatan demand dari green vehicle ini akan mendorong automaker untuk memproduksi kendaraan yang memang green. Nah, di sisi lain ini akan memberikan benefit bagi government dalam rangka percepatan untuk penerapan air quality improvement program sekaligus saving the climate. Nah, tapi memang ada beberapa catatan yang harus diterapkan tadi dalam rangka untuk menerapkan DVR, terutama nantinya kalau kita bisa mengadopsi ide yang sangat bagus ini, yaitu terkait dengan beberapa hal, termasuk bagaimana mengkalkulasi atau menghitung kerusakan dari penggunaan kendaraan yang tidak green, ya. Tadi disampaikan juga penjelasannya terkait dengan monetizing dari health impact, kemudian kerusakan tanaman, visibilitas, dan yang terakhir dampaknya terhadap perubahan iklim. Terakhir dibuat semacam scoring, sehingga dengan demikian nantinya akan bisa diformulasikan hasil green vehicle rating. Terima kasih. Keempat pembicara atau keempat panelis sudah menyampaikan paparannya. Terima kasih Miss Alison, Mr. Eli Izadi, Profesor Puji, dan tadi terakhir Miss Chandana. Ini masih ada waktu kurang lebih 10 menit. Kami persilahkan untuk yang bertanya, ya, atau kita membahas dulu yang ada di Q&A room, ya. Ini ada beberapa catatan, misalnya ada pertanyaan dari Bapak Cahyo Kartiko, ya. Definisi energi nasional. Mungkin nanti sayang dari Bappenas mungkin sudah tidak di acara ini lagi. Definisi energi nasional ini tentunya akan lebih pas dijawab oleh pemerintah, ya, dari staf pemerintah Indonesia tentunya. Kemudian ada juga pertanyaan lain dari Bapak Gideon Hasan. Bagaimana pandangan Anda, ini ditujukan kepada Mr. Ali Izadi, ya, atau bisa juga nanti dijawab oleh Miss Alison. Bagaimana pandangan Anda terkait hybrid electric vehicle first before battery electric vehicle? Nah, ini di Indonesia juga sangat pelik, ya, dan menciptakan polemik yang sangat panjang. Hybrid electric vehicle dulu atau battery electric vehicle dulu? Mohon Mr. Ali bisa menjawab ini. Mungkin nanti juga bisa ditambahkan oleh Miss Alison. Mr. Ali atau Miss Alison first, you can answer this.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. When IA did its net zero modelling, it covered both plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and electric vehicles, and it's interesting that some of the discussion that's come through the other panelists has been around range anxiety and actually how do you meet consumers' needs for longer distance travelling, and obviously plug-in hybrid electric vehicles facilitate that. I think again, as the discussion is all the sort of super interesting points that have been made, you know, it's going to be a parcel of measures, isn't it? It's going to be, modal shift, it's going to be two-wheelers playing a role, it's going to be the use of fuels. So I think it's kind of, you know, important to see things as an energy mix, both in the sort of short and longer term. So that's my kind of insights there.
Thank you, Ms. Alison. Mr. Izadi, are you there? Oke, kalau belum, kita akan coba pertanyaan berikutnya. Mungkin rekan co-moderator bisa membantu pertanyaan berikutnya yang
karena info 5 menit lagi ya Pak. Oke. Bapak chat aja nggak apa-apa.
Mr. Allen, you can answer before any question from Gideon Hassan. That's how about your opinion in relation the preference hybrid electric vehicle first before battery electric vehicle, because we have polling also in Indonesia, hybrid first or directly to the battery electric vehicle. 2 minutes maximum, Mr. Ali.
Thank you very much for the question. The way I would want to answer this question, it depends on whose perspective you're looking at. So hybrid vehicles as a technology are certainly easier for consumers to use today if they don't have access to charging. And if an automaker already has a hybrid vehicle lineup, so for example, say Toyota or Honda, then for them to try to accelerate selling those hybrids in newer markets, that's certainly a good way of trying to reduce emissions. Having said that, for automakers who don't have hybrids in their lineup already, it's a bit of a trickier calculations because they have to think about at what point battery electric vehicles become more competitive than hybrids. A hybrid vehicle today is, depending on the segment, is cheaper than battery electric vehicles, but longer term, as the cost of batteries decline rapidly, then battery electric vehicles will be cheaper than hybrids. So from the perspective of automakers, if they have existing hybrid lineups, then it makes perfect sense for them to actually accelerate and selling more of those. But if an automaker doesn't already have manufacturing for hybrid electric vehicles, from an investment perspective for them, it doesn't make sense to invest in that technology now, have it for 5 to 10 years only, and then jump ahead and do battery electric vehicles. From the policymakers, I think what's important to consider is putting in regulations in place that look at emissions as a whole. Certainly, policymakers can leave some room for technology choice by companies, but they can try to motivate this in terms of emission standards. So for example, if you look at the way that Europe has done this, for an automaker like Toyota, which has a large hybrid lineup, it can comply with the EU CO2 emission standards in the short term by relying on its hybrid sales, and it doesn't have to sell that many EVs, and it means that its fleet emissions overall is actually pretty attractive. For others, some of them, and I won't say any names, they sell a lot of heavy polluting internal combustion engine SUVs. So to offset those, they have to sell more battery electric vehicles. So ultimately, from that perspective, then you can't argue that, oh, this automaker sold more BEVs, so they're better. In reality, if their average fuel economy or if their average emission are the same, then it doesn't mean that because they just sold more BEVs, they did a better job. In fact, from a sort of an efficiency perspective, probably they didn't do a better job. So that's where I would say it's important to consider.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a very excellent answer from Mr. Izadi, and also before from Ms. Alison Pridmore. Because limited our time, I think we must finalize this session. Yes, jadi terima kasih Bapak Ibu sekalian, dan terutama pada keynote speaker Bapak Suharso Monoarfa, Menteri Perencanaan Pembangunan Republik Indonesia, yang tadi sudah menyampaikan keynote speech-nya. Dan juga terima kasih kepada panelis, Ms. Alison Pridmore from International Energy Agency, kemudian Mr. Ali, Head of Asia Pacific Research BloombergNEF, dan juga Profesor Puji Lestari dari ITV, Ms. Chandana Sasidharan for Energy Efficient Economy India. Terima kasih atas paparan yang sangat menarik, dan mohon maaf kepada para peserta apabila pertanyaan yang sudah disampaikan di Q&A room belum sempat terjawab karena keterbatasan waktu. Namun kami akan teruskan kepada keempat panelis untuk memberikan jawaban secara tertulis melalui email dan nanti akan disampaikan kepada Bapak-bapak, Ibu-ibu sekalian yang sudah mencantumkan alamat email saat pendaftaran. Dan kita harus mengakhiri plenary session atau second plenary session dengan topik Decarbonizing the Mobility System. Tadi disampaikan bahwa ke depan ini adalah menjadi sebuah keniscayaan mobilitas yang rendah karbon, mobilitas yang efisien dalam penggunaan energi, sehingga nantinya akan dicapai dua hal yang bisa berbarengan. Yang pertama, efisiensi energi, sekaligus bagaimana kita bisa mengendalikan emisi rumah kaca, karbon dioksida terutama. Dan di sisi lain tentu ini akan memberikan implikasi pada pertumbuhan ekonomi yang ditopang melalui penerapan kebijakan low carbon maupun energi efisiensi. Itu yang bisa kami pimpin di dalam sesi plenary sessions kedua ini, Decarbonizing the Mobility. Kurang dan lebihnya mohon maaf. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.